Geeks and geekettes, cats and kittens, and comic nistas everywhere. It's time again for Ask Chuck Dixon, where you get to ask me, a comic book professional of long-standing, decades-long career, about what I do for a living. And what I do for a living is I write comic books. And I share with you my knowledge, history, experience, sometimes candid, sometimes brutally candid, sometimes painfully candid. But it's all, all hands on deck, all skate, whatever it is that you want to know, you ask me, and I will try to explain it to you. Let's go to our first question. Jason Hall, you said a number of times you enjoy crossovers, so what did you think of the Marvel versus DC amalgam event from 1996? Did you and the creative team come up with the amalgamations for Bruce Wayne, Agent of S.H.I.E.L.D., or was that all from the Marvel DC brass? Also, has anyone ever confused you with Chuck D from Public Enemy? No, that's never happened. I was early days in the internet. I was often confused with a podiatrist, a pediatrician from Toronto. But after a while, I got search engine supremacy over that guy, and the rest is history. Amalgam was a concept thought of by some genius, and I mean that sincerely, at either Marvel or DC or both, maybe over a 3-martini lunch. I don't know. But comic sales were flagging in the late 90s. They were down from the stellar heights they had been at in the early 90s. And both companies were looking for ways to juice up sales. And they came up with this idea of combining forces for like the ultimate crossover. More a mashup than a crossover, where you would take two characters, one from either company, and sort of jam them together to create a brand new character, like taking Batman and Wolverine, just turning them into one character. And these were published simultaneously or in cooperation with one another by Marvel and DC. They all put their top talents on the characters on this project. They sold well. They were very popular. They were a lot of fun to write. And, they came up with some pretty cool concepts, which were all editorially driven. We were not, creative teams were not involved in the process of creating these mashups. And you had fun stuff like, Superboy meets Spider-Man. Batman meets Man-Thing. It was some crazy idea. This was one of my favorites, Bat-Thing, Larry Hama and Rodolfo DiMaggio. Just a gorgeous book. Challengers of the Fantastic, Iron Lantern. It was cool stuff, and all the creators I know had a blast working on it. I was given the concept of Bruce Wayne, Agent of S.H.I.E.L.D., and it was a good fit for me. I've been working on Batman for quite a while at this point, and I was a big fan of Nick Fury, Agent of S.H.I.E.L.D., particularly the Steranko era, and it was fun putting these two concepts together, and also a challenge because the conceit was these were comics from like an alternate universe where there was no Marvel, there was no DC, there was just amalgam. And so there was sort of this blending, this mix, this melange of these two massive comic book universes all created into one. And to make the conceit work and to make everybody at both companies happy, you had to have a 50-50 mix of concepts. So it's a lot like when you pour a bowl of cereal and you put the milk in, and as you're going along, sometimes you have to maybe add a little more cereal or add a little more milk to make the make the proper mix. And that's what was the deal here. I didn't get any notes, so I guess I hit it on the nose pretty much. But both companies were overseeing to make sure that they were equally represented, and that's understandable. It's a franchise mashup, and you want to make sure that both sides, both companies are represented and on stage to an equal degree. David Zawali asks, in your career in comics, have you ever worked with any of the old guard? Did you get to work with any Golden Age artists or Silver Age artists? If so, who and on what books? Well, it's weird because Punisher Warzone was kind of the entree for me to work with a lot of Silver Age and sometimes Golden Age artists that I was, admired. They were comic book idols of mine. And a lot of these older pros would come to Don Daly and say, do you have a Punisher story I could work on? And because Warzone was going pretty hot then, we were doing these 5-issue arcs. And so I got to work with some greats. I did a 5-issue arc with John Buscema, another one with Joe Kubert, who qualifies as a Golden Age artist. I think he started working in comics when he was 5. And then another one with Russ Heath, who I was a big admirer of. So I got to work with like these legends on my favorite comic book character, the Punisher. And it was cool. It was really cool. And they were, of course, the consummate pros, perfect gentlemen, as the older pros always were. Now, earlier in my career, I got to work with John Severin, who was a Golden Age artist as well as a Silver Age artist. He began work in the 40s after he got out of the Army. And I got to work with him on my very first stories at Marvel at Savage Tales. We worked together on maybe 4, maybe 5 of these black and white 8-page stories. And I was in comic book heaven every minute that I was working on this. I got to work with Dan Spiegel a couple of times. He did some fill-in stories on Skywolf back in the day, the backup stories in Airboy. He came and filled in on a few of them. And the last thing I worked with him on was an issue of The Simpsons, which was it was me and Dan Spiegel, because Spiegel was a cartoonist as well as a dramatic comic book artist. And the conceit of this issue is it's a satire on DC War Comics, featuring Grandpa Simpson and his memoirs about fighting the Nazis. And it was a blast to work on, especially with someone who had done DC War Comics and who got everything. I mean, we formatted it exactly like one of those comics, and it was a scream to work on. And I thank Bill Morrison and Bongo for giving me the opportunity. George Evans was a guy, when I was living in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, George Evans was living in Mount Joy, which is, just across the river, just across the Susquehanna from Lancaster. And I would run into him at store appearances and things like that. Went out to dinner with him a few times. And when Tim Truman and I were working on Airboy, we asked him over and over and over again if he would do a Skywolf backup. But he always turned us down regretfully because he was receiving Social Security. And if he earned too much money, because he was still doing the Secret Agent X9 comic strip, if he earned too much money, they would reduce his benefits. And he couldn't risk that. Very, very sad. But he did do us a cover. He managed to fit a cover into his budget that didn't violate Social Security rules. I just wish he'd been able to draw more for us. And today I kind of regret why didn't I just offer him cash? Although George was a stand-up, straight arrow guy, he might not have wanted to cheat the tax man in that way. For those IRS agents listening, I'm only kidding. Now, I didn't get to work with Murphy Anderson, but I got to meet him at a lot of cons. And what a guy. What a gentleman. Just a stand-up dude. And he would tell tons of stories about working, particularly for DC, in the Golden and Silver Age, and what a freaking nightmare the editors were. And just a really cool guy, and obviously a major talent, big part of the DC comics that I read growing up. If Murphy was working on it when I was a kid, I bought it. Even if it was, the usual dull DC claptrap that they were doing mid '60s. Another guy I got to talk to a lot, never got to work with, was C.C. Beck. C.C. Beck would come to the cons, and sadly, this legendary Captain Marvel artist, hardly anybody talked to him. They were into like the big new, tyros, the young guys who were, flexing their comic book muscles at the time. They were the fan faves. And Beck was kind of always had a lot of downtime, just sort of sitting at the table. And, so the upside for me was I got to talk to him a lot. And a real cool guy, super cool guy. In addition to that, I've met any number of guys from the Golden Age. I mean, I had a casual conversation with Jack Kirby once. I met Steve Ditko and talked a little. And spent, some time with Don Heck as well at conventions. So, I've met my share of these gentlemen, and am grateful for it, because anyone who works in comics works in the shadow of these guys. And hey, it's a twin spin. David's got another question for us, and here it comes. Also, which version of Captain Marvel do you prefer? The original Fawcett concept or any of the revamped DC versions? I'm a Fawcett Captain Marvel man. I only really like the Captain Marvel stories from the 40s and 50s, particularly the early 50s. They were really onto something before DC sued them out of existence. And I really dug these comics. They had a charm all their own. They had a tone all of their own. They were great superhero adventure stories, obviously written primarily for children, but they never pandered. Otto Binder, an experienced science fiction writer, really took care. I mean, he really constructed engaging stories with real stakes and real consequences, featuring, this enormous cast of characters, this huge ensemble cast. And though they were written for kids, even reading them now as an adult comic book fan, I find them engaging. I find once I've started one, I have to complete it, because they were page turners. They would present these really difficult dilemmas and challenges for the big red cheese that he would have to solve. And there's a lot of humor in it. These stories can be read as parodies of the superhero genre almost, because they have a lot of fun with the superhero genre, breaking the fourth wall a lot through Billy Batson. But they never mock the genre. They just have fun with the genre. And it's just good stuff. It's just well-constructed stories. The later iterations, I mean, when DC brought it back in the 70s, though there is whimsy in these stories, the DC pressed down on the whimsy button and just never let it up. The whimsy button got stuck. And it was all whimsy and very not particularly interesting storylines, stories without any stakes or consequences. And they weren't as funny, they weren't as charming, and sometimes they were just cloyingly, mawkishly sentimental, which the original series never had that element. When you introduce sentimentality into a story, you've lost me, because I don't like being manipulated. Other versions of Captain Marvel later on in DC, where they tried to either grow him up or reboot him or make him more of a cohesive element in the DCU, I really don't care for, because even though a lot of them are well crafted, well written, I mean, they're good comics, they just kind of leave everything I like about Captain Marvel behind. And I don't know how you would bring Captain Marvel back today maybe it's not possible. Maybe it's not possible to recreate this era today or revisit it. But if you ever get a chance to read any of these older Captain Marvel stories in the Fawcett run, I urge you to try them out, because, if you're a comic book fan, comic book historian, they're really an important part of how the superhero genre was built. And in the 40s and 50s, they were superior to anybody else's superhero output. Captain Marvel was the best of the superheroes on the comic book stands at the time. And because they didn't pander to children. They aimed their stories at children, but they didn't pander. They made sure there was always a story. Chart and Jacob 93. my question to you is, what sort of tips you may have about artist-writer collaborative process? What do you find are some do's and don'ts? And what were the best and worst collaborations you yourself have worked on in your career? Well, I don't want to name names like worst collaborations, although I did do an issue of a comic once which featured a big nasty alien creature, and the artist didn't seem to understand that the alien creature had to look the same every time we saw him. Which is and this guy's first language was English, so there's no excuse. No, each time in every panel, the alien was an entirely, completely, utterly different creature, which must have been confusing as hell with the readers. It certainly confused me when I saw the page. I didn't even recognize it as a story I'd written. I said, where are all these different aliens coming from? It was supposed to be one alien with one look. Do a model sheet, follow it. Just don't invent something completely new in every panel. That was a bad collaboration. But 99.9% of the time, my collaborations have always been super successful. I've always been really happy working with the artists I've been working with. And this isn't, shining you on or glad handing. It's true. Maybe it's luck. I've just been lucky to collaborate with some awesome people over the years. Some of them I've collaborated with for decades. People like Gary Quapis and Graham Nolan. And many, many others, all my Argentinos amigos, did a lot of work together. And maybe that's the key. I found people that I could, jam with, and I stayed with them, for the most part. But, even when they were, at DC, they would always try me out with new guys. Like I wrote an awful lot of comic artists' first professional stories, guys that are like superstar big names now. And even then, okay, it's a learning process for both of us. I'm maybe there was something deficient in my script. Maybe I needed to make it clearer, whatever, and I think that's the secret to a successful collaboration. You have to be flexible. I've never been one of those writers who said, look, every word I write is carved in stone and you have to follow it slavishly. No, I've never been that way. I understand it is words and pictures. I'm the words, the artist is the pictures, and we both have an equal say in the outcome. And in some cases, the artist has more of a say because he's actually working longer hours on this project, whatever it is we're working on. And I want to hear from him because he's sitting at that board, drawing this page, and hopefully thinking about it. Famously, I'm working with Frank Fosco not famously, but I'm working with Frank Fosco on Something Big at Arctoons, and a series called Something Big. And I hear from him a lot. He's got a lot of input. He has a lot of ideas, or he says, maybe this would work better, maybe that would work better. And I appreciate hearing from him. I mean, in 100% of the cases, he could have just made the change without talking to me, but he wants to get my okay, which is great. That's part of the flexibility, isn't it? Is informing your partner of what you're doing, making sure they're okay with it too. But, it's been that way with a lot of artists, a lot of back and forth, phone calls and emails and texts. And then some artists not. Working with John Buscema, as I mentioned earlier, I never heard from John Buscema. He took my scripts, did amazing freaking things with them, and didn't need to ask me my opinion. Joe Kubert, on the other hand, I heard from quite a bit. Now you figure Joe, why would he have to contact me? He knows what to do, but he always was cognizant of the fact that, this was originally my story, and he wanted to make sure that he was presenting it in the fashion in which I imagined it. Are we on the same page? So I guess the do's are be flexible. The don'ts are don't work with guys who don't seem to understand how to interpret a script. So, I like to imagine my scripts are clear. I think after all this time, I've never heard a complaint. So there you go. All right, MG, you've probably answered this, but any behind-the-scene details on what was the deal with Spoiler getting tortured by Black Mask and killed? It just seems like such a bizarre creative choice. Well, I don't really have anything behind the scenes because I wasn't at DC at the time. You try not to take things personally, and I didn't. I thought, well, they just randomly chose Spoiler, a very, very popular character, and randomly chose her to kill her. in a brutal and ugly way because they felt that was what was needed for the story. Myself, I don't think brutally torturing and killing a teenage girl should ever be part of a comic book story, but that's just me. And, you don't want to take it personally, and I didn't until they nuked Bloodhaven. So when they killed all of my supporting cast in Nightwing, because I created an enormous ensemble cast, when they killed them all individually, and then just to make sure, had Chemo or Chemo basically destroy the city to make sure all of my other ancillary characters were dead. I started to think, man, maybe they have an agenda. But yeah, I was sad when they killed Spoiler, but then they did hire me to bring her back. Or not necessarily bring her back. I don't quite understand how she was brought back. It's just like, well, was that all a dream? Did she just not die but simply got better? I don't know. But I was grateful to be brought back to bring her back to life. I don't know if she's alive or dead now in the DCU. Maybe they've killed her and reincarnated her a dozen times since then. I really don't know. But she was always a very, very popular character with fans. And I get lots of questions like this one about her because, which is, I enjoy because of all the characters I created at DC, she's the one that I feel the most affinity for, the one that I feel was the most three-dimensional. There's nothing left unsaid about Spoiler by me, I believe. So anyway, Guy Cordray. Raiders of the Lost Ark is one of my favorite movies of all time, but my buddy seems to think it has a major problem. The hero is pointless in his own quest. Upon being opened, the Ark would have zapped and melted all those Nazis, whether Indy had been present or not. I already have my thoughts on this. What are yours? I think that's an idiotic theory. It's one of those things people say at a party, to like make everybody think that they're wiser than everybody else there. Like, did you ever know, or did you ever think of this? Because I have. And but it's an opinion I hear a lot about this movie, that Indy and Marion's presence in the movie is pointless because it would have ended the same way anyway. The Nazis all would have gotten, gacked by the Old Testament justice that was delivered upon them, and Indy didn't have to be there at all. Okay, well, that's kind of a silly notion when you think about what was Indy's quest. Was Indy's quest to kill a whole bunch of Nazis? No. Now, if anything, the Nazis are in the way of his quest. And his quest is what, as an archaeologist? It's to preserve, save, archive, and preserve for the future ancient artifacts. Well, isn't that what he did in the end? Did the Nazis end up with it? Was the Ark used as an end table in Hitler's office in the end? No. It was taken to a safe place, hidden in the endless, bottomless well of Washington bureaucracy where no one will ever find it again. And it's just kind of silly to say, well, it would have been the same. The ending would have been the same whether he and Marion were there at all. And that's simply not true. Because what if they weren't there? And all the Nazis died, and the Ark closes itself. Remember, the Ark closes itself again. And it's just sort of left there in this island in the North Atlantic. Well, who knew it was there? The Nazis did. They knew where that submarine went. Presumably, there's a whole bunch more crewmen on that submarine who might come to check and see what happened to the guys they left off. And it's kind of amusing to think that maybe they'd open the Ark too and all get killed. Maybe this thing would be like this giant mousetrap for Nazis, that Hitler would send more and more entourages of stormtroopers to this little island in the North Atlantic to see what happened to the last guys he sent there. And, eventually this, the landscape would be covered with partially melted Nazis. But that's not what happened in the movie. The arc closes itself, and Indy's able to preserve it for eternity. He's able to preserve it to a museum, which was his raison d'etre. That's why he was there. It wasn't about all the Nazis dying. It was about Indy making sure the Ark was preserved for humanity and kept from the hands of, evil men. And he accomplished that, didn't he? And he couldn't have accomplished that if he wasn't there. So, just a silly idea that it's one of these things that people say and they really don't think. And it's not their idea. Your buddy's probably repeating it, because I've seen this idea presented over and over and over again. And like I said, it's pretty silly. All right, Gentle Savage asks, Mr. Dixon, before you stopped writing comics for mainstream companies like DC and Marvel, were there any other characters outside of those you've already written for you would have liked to write for? Hold on. Gotta take a drink. Okay, that was water, by the way. Well, I've always said Fantastic Four. Graham Nolan and I fantasize about doing a run on Fantastic Four, a year or two. Since it's a substantial, significant run, where we get to tell a bunch of stories. And we even know the first story we would do, which of course has Submariner in it, in a way you've never seen him before. Not the silly version of the Black Panther movies, but in a situation that you've never seen him before, which he needs the Fantastic Four's help to solve a underwater mystery. And just to give you a clue, it's an underwater mystery in a sea that is not on this planet. So there you go, a little tantalizing glimpse of a story that will never be. Kazar or Kazar, depending on what side of the Mason-Dixon line you live on, is another one. Irresistible to me, jungle character, Tarzan knockoff. Tough guy with a knife fighting dinosaurs in a weird underworld, subterranean universe, much akin to Pellucidar by Edgar Rice Burroughs. And I love the Pellucidar series. As testimony to that, I worked 7 years on a weekly Pellucidar comic strip with Gary Quapis for EdgarRiceBurroughs.com. So yeah, this would be a lot of fun. I'm a big, huge Marvel fan, and a lot of these characters would be fun. It would be challenging to take on Doctor Strange or Cloak and Dagger or write, the Hulk, whatever, of any of them. But just off the top of my head, Fantastic Four and Kazar come to mind. And we go over to DC, and it's the New Gods. New Gods all the way down, baby. I've gotten to play with the New Gods a little bit in Bane Conquest and Superman Aliens. But I really like to dig in, and because I really like what Kirby did. And when people say, "Oh, Kirby couldn't write," you are full of it, because there are simply unforgettable scenes in the Fourth World epic. Yeah, it's messy, it's choppy, it's episodic, it's all over the place, but there's some fantastic stuff here. Absolutely fantastic. So some of my favorite scenes in all of comics occur in that continuity, and I'd love to spend some time on the Fourth World. I really would. Superman, another one. I'd like to do a substantial run on Superman, because it's weird. As I grow older, I have more and more affection for this character, more and more affinity, and also see it as a challenge to create interesting Superman stories, for a character that's been around this long, been through every permutation. And you would think every story's been told, and I'd like to think that's not true. Not just for me. I don't like the idea that every story's been told. How's that possible? The depth and breadth of the human imagination, I believe, is limitless. So there are things that you could do with Superman. I wouldn't change anything. I wouldn't reboot him. I would just explore Superman. And the big challenge for me would be coming up with challenges for him. That would force him to the limits of his strength and intellect. And that's one thing I think is often left behind with Superman, is that this guy's a smart guy. He's a very smart, he has a lightning fast analytical mind, combined with this humanity And that's what makes him interesting to me. Hey, Gentle Savage Twin Spin, and let's get to it. Also, are you a fan of stand-up comedy at all? If so, who are some of your favorite comedians? I mean, who isn't a fan of stand-up comedy? I like to laugh. I don't think there's anybody who says, I don't like stand-up comedy. Now, I'm not a fan to the point where I go to comedy clubs all the time or have a website. But growing up as a kid, is really when I was a kid, stand-up was coming into its heyday. And almost every variety show had a stand-up bit. Every late night show had a stand-up bit. And my favorite, and still my favorite, still I consider the funniest guy who ever lived, is Jonathan Winters. Jonathan Winters did improv for the most part. He stepped on stage with no material, didn't know what he was going to do, didn't have any bits, didn't repeat himself. That's the proof. All the years I ever saw Jonathan Winters, I never saw him repeat a gag, never saw him repeat a phrase. He had little things he would do to intro bits that were funny. His little notebook that he kept on him that he would refer to occasionally and then make jokes about the notebook. But even then, the jokes about the notebook were always different. This guy had an incredible mind. And it's an inspirational story, Jonathan Winters, because he was under so much pressure with the improv that he ended up committed to an asylum. And I remember when I was a little kid, my parents knew I loved Jonathan Winters so much that they would wake me up if he was on the Jack Parr show. Now, Jack Parr came on at 11:30 at night. It was the original Tonight Show. And they would wake me, okay. In the comment section, you're going to say Steve Allen was the first host of the Tonight Show. Yeah, okay. Jack Parr was the second host of the Tonight Show. So, my parents would wake me up to see Jonathan Winters. I would watch the whole Jack Parr show because, Winters would come on early and then sit on the couch. And I remember, and I was maybe 6 years old. And I remember they did the little thing at the end of the show, where are you going to be? I want to be at Lake Tahoe through October. They go down the couch. Where's everybody going to be? And Johnny Winters is the last one on the couch. And Jack Parr says, where are you going to be, Johnny? And he goes, I'll be getting committed this weekend. And the audience exploded. It's such a funny line. But the truth of the matter was he was committed that weekend. He knew he was going into a sanitarium because he had put so much pressure on himself that he had a nervous breakdown. And he went through therapy and all the rest of it. I hope I'm not boring you with the story, but I find it fascinating. He went through all kinds of therapy. The only thing that worked was his wife. His wife said to him, God gave you this talent to make people laugh and to just make stuff up. And your mind is so quick that you would be bored with written material. You eschew all of that. You just want the stuff to fly out there. And she said, some nights it may not work, but she says most nights it will, because you've been given this talent and you have to have faith in yourself, faith in God, and faith in the talent that he gave you, that you can do this. And stop pressuring yourself over it. She wouldn't let him quit. And from that point on, Jonathan Winters was a freaking tsunami of comedy. Touring clubs, appearing on TV, appearing in movies, appearing in television, always funny, always at the top of his game. And it was all because of, his wife had faith in him, and ultimately he had faith in himself. So, he'll always be my favorite. Another guy cracked me up as a kid, this is long before he did movies, was Woody Allen. He made very rare television appearances doing stand-up, but when he did, it was a pisser. And I was lucky enough to get to see Woody Allen in his last stand-up tour in the early 70s. And he was very funny then. But, Allen, it's, this agile mind, this gift for the absurd, his impeccable comic timing, very, very funny guy. Now, another guy I was absolutely devoted to when I was a child was Bill Cosby. And every kid that I knew loved Bill Cosby. I had all of his albums. Most of the kids in my class could recite even his longer routines by heart. the chicken heart and things like that. We just listened to them so often; they were just ingrained in our minds. And just a massively talented guy who unfortunately fell on suffered the fate of so many who become get to reach the pinnacle of the form in entertainment. But his stand-up routines today still stand up. They're still funny. He's a funny guy. And his observations about life and the rest. You listen to him and I guess you could say he's tainted by what happened to him later in life, but I can kind of separate the artist from the man. And I remember when I listened to him become a kid again, listening to him as a kid. So I'm grateful for that. Now, people after that, Sam Kinison was one of the funniest people that ever lived. And fearless. And by today's standard of comedy, that fearlessness stands out. Because with a lot of comics simply refusing to tour because of wokeism and political correctness and fear of being canceled, I wish Kinison was around today. I think if Sam Kinison was around today, none of that would have happened because he would have just bored into the face of it. He would have stood against the tide. He would have stood in the middle of the road and said, "Stop this BS," because this was a guy who would never back down. He just didn't care. Fearless guy. It's a shame he's not around anymore because we need him now more than ever. Now, the two comics that are working today that I find funniest, well, they couldn't be more different from each other. I really like Brian Regan. His affable, silly, dopey guy encountering the mysteries of life never fails to crack me up. His stories about his childhood, stories about things he's doing now. He's one of the few comedians who will actually use tedium to be funny. He'll bore down on a joke until it's not funny anymore and stay with it until it sort of gets infused with humor once again, just by the sheer length that he's going on about. He has these rants and they're never mean or nasty or anything else. And it's very much about observational humor a la Seinfeld. But there's just something about it that makes this guy unique for me amongst other stand-up guys. I just find him hysterical. Now, total, in some ways the same, but in other ways very, very different, is Dave Chappelle. And I know I'm like, oh yeah, Dave Chappelle. Yeah, I guess you like the Beatles too. I mean, okay, yeah, but everybody recognizes Chappelle's an awesome stand-up comic. And he is. I mean, you look what he's done. The recent Saturday Night Live appearance is astounding in his ability to gauge the audience, timing, as well as the material. I mean, his presentation, his material, all the rest of it, it's impeccable. And his ability to communicate and reach out. And once again, he shares with Kinison the fearlessness. And what I said about Kinison changing the zeitgeist of today, well, look at what Chappelle's done. He has changed the zeitgeist of today. He has stood athwart the stream and said, stop. Have we lost our senses? Have we lost our sense of humor? Have we lost our common sense? And he shares that with all the great comics that they just went out there and they just did it because what does it take to stand up in front of a bunch of people and make them laugh? I mean, you have to have the guts of a burglar. You have to be tough. There's no crybabies and fragile egos in this business. And Chappelle is, obviously at the peak of his powers right now. And a prime example of that, of a guy's like, I'm going to make people laugh and I don't care if it upsets you. I don't care who it outrages because after all, isn't that kind of the point? The court jester is there to poke fun at the powerful and make the rest of us laugh. So there you go. What you reading? Well, what I've been reading is this series from 2000 AD called Lawless by Dan Abnett. and Phil Winslade, two superior comic book craftsmen. Abnett never disappoints with his stories, and Phil Winslade is one of my favorites. I hope he's popular in the UK because he doesn't get a lot of attention here. And I actually worked with Phil. He inked a Car Warriors series of mine way back in the beginnings of both of our careers. And he just does a hell of a job. This one is basically a futuristic Western. A female judge is sent out into the cursed earth to be the lone law person in a mining town following a war with an alien invader. And when I was first reading it, it's just really well crafted. It's suspenseful. It's funny in parts. Like anything in 2000 AD, it's outrageous. The action is fast and furious, and the violence is brutal. And the language is nasty, and it's everything a 2000 AD story should be. And at first, because I'm looking at it through the lens of 2022, I'm thinking, this character's kind of a Mary Sue, She's coming in, and she's like, the minute she arrives, she's the baddest badass in the story, even though there's, mech military robots and giant sentient gorillas and tough guys and bounty hunters. She's always the baddest badass in the room. And then I realized she's a judge. All the judges are Mary Sue characters. They're all somewhat of a caricature. And once I got over that nonsense of having to think about things like that, I really enjoyed the story. And I recommend it to anybody. But my recommendation is tinged by the fact that the series is hard to follow in the US because you got to buy the paperbacks. And I bought the first paperback, and I can't find the second paperback anywhere. Nobody has it for love or money, and I refuse to get it on Kindle. I want a copy of this second part, and I think there's 4 trade paperbacks in all, but I can't keep reading after the first one if I can't find the second one. So I will continue my hunt. Don't worry. And when I do, I'll come back and tell you about it. All right, what you watching? What have I been watching? Well, I've been watching a lot. But one thing I wanted to talk about was the Christmas Story Christmas. It's on HBO Max. It is a sequel to the original Christmas Story movie. And if you like the original Christmas Story, you kind of have to see this one because it has so many of the original cast members in it. But generally, it fails. There's some terrific scenes in it, but because it's a Christmas movie, it departs from the reality. I mean, the original movie is based on Gene Shepard's hyperbolic memoirs of his childhood growing up in Indiana. And this movie takes his character, his made-up character Ralphie, into adulthood, but not in the way Gene Shepard was. They imagine a different future for Ralphie than Gene Shepard had, which I guess was they kind of had to because Gene Shepard, although he went on to tremendous success in radio, his private life was not anything particularly lovable. Let me put it that way. It's nothing you'd want to make a Christmas movie about. Not that he was a bad guy or a nasty guy or anything like that, but he was a difficult guy, and he didn't have a family that he lived with and all this other stuff. So they create a Ralphie who's struggling to become a professional writer. He's struggling in 1973 to become what Gene Shepard already was, a very successful best-selling author and radio personality. But where this one fails for me is that it introduces sentiment. I've mentioned sentimentality before. It introduces sentiment to the story, which the first movie doesn't have any of because it's from a child's point of view, and children don't tend to be sentimental. It gets a little mawkish at points, and that's something that was never in the original film. And for my money, sentiment should never be part of any Christmas story. I will forgive Christmas Carol because it's the first great Christmas story, and it's got full of sentiment at the end. But for the most part, all the Christmas stories that I enjoy are free of, you know, syrupy, goopy, schmaltzy stuff. But that said, if you like the original, you kind of have to see this at least once because so many of the child actors are back as adults playing the role. Flick and Schwartz and others are back. Randy are back to play the characters they played in the original as adults. And the timing's perfect. 73 is perfect age for these guys to be. And I will tell you all of the characters who are back because the best one who comes back makes for the best scenes in the movie. So I won't spoil that surprise. And maybe I've intrigued you enough with that to watch it. And it is worth watching it for those scenes. I really like them. So yeah, if you're a fan of the original, check it out. Kind of have to. If you've never seen the original, you're going to be completely lost because there are so many Easter eggs and references back. This film is so reverential to the first film, probably to its detriment. But and the recasting of Julie Haggerty as his mom, I think, was a stroke of genius. She's very funny in this. So, BrunoBookstore@gmail.com. BrunoBookstore@gmail.com. That's how you reach me. It's the most direct way. I check this email a couple of times a day. You can ask questions down here below the video. You can ask questions on Facebook and Twitter, but chances are I might miss it. So you want to go over to BrunoBookstore@gmail.com. And while I have you, Subscribestar. If you want to support me directly in my work, either at ArcTunes, which are free, or with these videos, which are free, but take up time. So it'd be nice if I got a little bit of remuneration now and again. If you would care to go to Subscribestar and sign up for $5 a month, you actually get a bunch of physical stuff. You get a package of physical stuff, signed comics, rarities, all kinds of things. So if you ever wanted my signature on something, it's the quickest, most expedient way to get it. And then every month thereafter, you'll get digital goodies. I'll send you unpublished scripts, artwork you may never have seen before, complete files on a lot of the work I've done in the past. And every once in a while, I'll throw in some, extra goodie for subscribers, physical goodie. Recently, I did a 28 millimeter gaming miniature of myself for people that subscribe. And that's still available. You can still get that if you subscribe now on the $5 level. And there's a $1 level if you just want to give me an attaboy. But I would appreciate it. And that is Subscribestar /Chuck Dixon. And just hit that button and you are off to the races. Also, Spin Rack. Announcement about Spin Rack, our first mobile game featuring characters created by Graham Nolan and myself. Our first mobile games, I should say, are going to be up. You'll be able to play them on your phone before the year's over. They are working hard developing these games. Graham and I have been in multiple meetings, correcting details, suggesting things, writing text for these things, doing intro and outro videos, and all the rest of it. And these games will be up from Spin Rack. Remember, Spin Rack is creator-driven and creator-owned. Graham and I do not license our properties to Spin Rack. Graham and I are Spin Rack. So look for the mobile games. I'll be announcing them here. I'll probably do a special video. And next time we talk, or maybe the time after that, I'll go into a little bit more detail and show you some game footage. What about that? So anyway, I want to thank you for listening. I want to thank you for watching. If I don't do another video before Christmas, I want to wish you a Merry Christmas.